Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we're going to review why it's important to do a project pre-assessment and how to do one using a MinMax analysis. There are a few prerequisite lessons that may help you in learning some of the concepts that we review in this lesson. Those are the lessons are the corporate CTQ drill down, project financial savings, and project prioritization using a QFD tool. Let's start by defining what is a pre-assessment and why it's important.
Well, as the name suggests, the pre-assessment is a way for us to assess the project ahead of time before we get too deep into it. Well, why is it that we'd want to do that? Well, it's a way for us to help validate the potential problem, the scope, and the benefits that are in the project. It's also a way for us to ensure that we got the right agreement about the need for the project itself and that we can anticipate the right level of value we can expect from the project. So why is it that we want to look into a pre-assessment now? Well, basically it fits into the logical order of the things that we've gone through so far as we identified and prioritized the different project opportunities. For example, by this point you may have already run a QFD, which is a way for us to help prioritize the different project opportunities that are available so you can assess which one you need to work on first. As well, you might have already done a CTQ drill down, which, as we reviewed before, is a way for us to understand how these opportunities align to what's most important to the business, to the overall corporate needs or the strategy of the business. So at this point for the pre-assessment, again, it's going to help us validate that the projects are truly critical, they're really something that's necessary, and how they're aligned to the business strategy. So do we really have to do a pre-assessment? Well, no, we don't have to, but I think the proper question is to ask, what's the risk if we don't do a pre-assessment? So what if we're working on the project and we didn't do a pre-assessment and we find out that the scope is too large, where it requires much more time, cost, or resources than we originally expected? Or what if the opportunity doesn't align to what is most important to the business, identified through the corporate CTQ drill down? Or what if we find that the sponsor really isn't bought in as we originally had expected? Or what if we find that the benefits are just not as large as we originally expected as well? So let's kind of weigh these things together and compare the different rewards and risk of looking at the pre-assessment. Basically, there is going to be some investment, some cost and time and effort to actually do the pre-assessment. Granted, that's the cost that we have to have on one side of the equation, but on the other side, we're getting a reward from it. That is the team confidence. In other words, by doing the pre-assessment, our team that's working on the project can be more confident in understanding the value they can expect in doing this project and why it's so important. As well, we're eliminating the risk where we're ensuring we're not going to spend too much cost or too much time for something that isn't necessary, where we don't find out at the end of the project this is something that we shouldn't have been doing. As well, we're mitigating the risk of not having the sponsors buy-in. By getting the sponsors buy-in right up front, their agreement right up front, we can ensure we've got that agreement we need in order to make the project successful. As well, we are eliminating the risk of how the project opportunity aligns to what's most important to the business, again, to the CTQ drill down. And also we're mitigating the risk of avoiding those benefits that we think are large, but they end up being small benefits instead. So, though the pre-assessment won't actually eliminate all these risks necessarily, it's a way for us to at least address these right up front at the very beginning before we start the project, so that at least we have a way of understanding what we can expect as we execute the project to understand whether it's really worth the effort or not.
Well, if a pre-assessment sounds good to you, then you may be thinking, how do I do a pre-assessment?
Well, doing a pre-assessment is pretty much like filling out a checklist for things that you need to ask and identify as you work through the pre-assessment. So the items that you want to identify in this checklist are broken down into three basic categories. First of all, understanding the problem. Next, understanding the support for the project. And finally, what are the expected benefits? So let's go through these one by one. First, in understanding the problem, which is really a good piece of the define phase of DMAIC that will be under the define portion of the future training videos. First of all, we want to understand what's the background for this particular opportunity, which might be a background statement that you try to fill out to understand some of the context behind the situation. Next, we want to understand what the measurable pain is that's being felt in the business. This is really like the problem statement. Again, we have a whole other section that addresses both the problem statement and the background statement to help us understand really why this is even an issue and what the pain is that we're trying to address in the project. And then next we want to identify what's in scope and what's out of scope so we can clearly understand where we need to target this opportunity. Next, we want to look into the support for the project itself. So we want to understand who would be the sponsor or champion for this particular project, and do they agree and fully support in supplying the resources necessary to work this project. Also, we want to ask who else would be considered a critical stakeholder for this project opportunity. Although it might be a particular sponsor or champion you're working with, you might learn that there are other groups that are essential for including as stakeholders as part of this effort as well. Next, we want to ask, how does this opportunity align with the corporate CTQs? This goes back to that CTQ drill down. Again, we want to understand how it fits into what's most important to the business, how this aligns from the level 3 CTQ all the way up to at least the level 1. And then next we want to ask, is the data really available for us to measure and analyze the problem? It's not very uncommon for a project opportunity to arise, and then as you begin to explore it, you find that there's some sort of system upgrade that's going to be occurring that's going to make a major change in how you collect your data, or how your data is at least going to be measured. So it's really important to understand that up front. If there are recent changes or anticipated changes related to how you're going to collect your data, because it's so important to making sure that you got the right data eventually for doing analysis as part of the project. Next, under the expected benefits section, we want to ask, what are the minimum or maximum benefits that can be expected from this effort? That's the MinMax analysis, which we're going to get into next. And then last, we want to ask, what are the type and the amount of financial savings that could be expected? So we don't want to just understand the dollar amounts straightforward, but we want to categorize those dollar amounts based off of how we categorize the financial benefits that we addressed in a previous training video. So how do you get all this information that you're looking for in this checklist? Well, I recommend starting first with whoever contacted you, initiated this particular effort that you'll be working. Go back to that person. They should help you in finding out who all the resources are for helping to answer these questions and complete this checklist. So while you're pursuing those answers, you may be able to find out all the different things that make this project opportunity viable and learn about that viability. And later on, we're going to get into the define phase tools that will help you in understanding, again, some of these other areas that are related to the define phase, like the problem statement and background statement. So these are things, even if you did this now during the pre-assessment, you're basically doing some of those things as part of the define phase right up front in the very beginning as part of this process. So it's not going to be wasted effort at all. And as I mentioned, next what we're going to get into is the MinMax analysis, which is a way to help us quickly size this particular opportunity. So once you got all this information for the pre-assessment, what are you going to do with it? Basically, I recommend that you compile all your answers together and review them with the primary contact that you have for this particular opportunity. If you could get with the sponsor, that would be ideal, or maybe it's a champion, but you basically want to go back to whoever your primary resource is that you're working with about this effort. So if you find that the opportunity is viable, then at least you've got all the answers that you would need to help embed into your project for answering the other parts of the project as you go forward with the project. But if you find that the opportunity is not viable after doing this pre-assessment, then you want to review it with the sponsor, make sure that they agree with everything you found, and see if they're willing for you to close the project, because it's much better to find this out up front now and close the project up front before you spend so much time and effort on something that later on would yield no benefits at all.
Now let's talk about what a MinMax analysis is, an example of how it can be used.
Well, the MinMax analysis is basically a calculation that helps answer the question, what's the minimum or maximum benefits that we can expect from this particular project? So if we find that the minimum benefits, that is for the very worst case, the very minimum that we can expect is still very substantial, then it's probably going to be a very worthwhile opportunity after all, and we probably should pursue the project. However, if we find out from the opposite perspective that the maximum benefits that we can expect, that is the very best case if everything works out perfectly and those maximum benefits are still not substantial, then it's probably not a worthwhile project opportunity for us. Now, which one do you calculate as you pursue this? Well, if it feels like it's a small opportunity, if it feels small, then I would recommend just aiming for calculating the minimum opportunity. Otherwise, you could probably start with calculating what you think might be the maximum opportunity. If you can calculate both, that's ideal, but I would use this as a guide. Now let me throw an example for you, and basically going to use a metric that's very often used among many different types of call centers, and it's called issue resolution. resolution, or IR, is basically a metric that is used for surveying customers who call into a call center to assess whether the issue that initiated their call in the first place, was that issue resolved. So usually it's a survey that asks the customer, have we resolved your issue? Typically the answers are going to be yes, no, or I don't know. So yes, we have resolved it. No, the issue was not resolved, or I'm not sure. I don't know if the issue was resolved. So this is based off of a real-world example, and in this particular call center we found that there was about 6% of the customers who answered I don't know when they were surveyed about whether their issue was resolved. So what we assumed as part of the project, or everyone that was part of the project assumed, that these customers are probably going to be a lot easier to convert to a yes than those who are answering no. Think of it like you have the yes on one side of the fence and no's on the other side of the fence, and those who are just straddling the fence were like the I don't know folks. So we just thought, hey, if they're that close to being a yes, maybe we can just easily tip them over to the yes side, and it's far easier to do that than to try to completely convert someone who was a no to answer as yes for this type of metric. So that was kind of the assumption behind it, and since it was 6% of folks who answered I don't know, we saw it as a huge opportunity possibly to increase the metric itself. So basically, from a min-max analysis perspective, we wanted to ask, what's the maximum IR benefit that we can expect when we convert all those I don't knows to a yes? So we approached it in two different ways. The first straightforward way was we want to understand the impact to the actual IR metric itself, the rate. So this is the breakdown of how we assessed it. Basically, I'm going to draw my mouse on here just to show that in the as-is perspective, we just simplified this to say if we surveyed 100 folks, currently we saw that there was about an 85% IR, let's say, for example. So that basically meant that there was 85 out of the 100 that were answering yes. But when we started to explore this in this min-max analysis perspective, we actually found something different in how the metric was calculated. So from an as-is perspective, we had 100 surveys, for example. Basically, in order to get an 85% for the IR rate, that would mean there would be 80 people who were answering yes. We already knew that there were 6 of them who were answering I don't know, because we said there was a 6% of the customers who answered I don't know. Then that left that there were 14 of those who answered no. So basically, the way they calculated the IR, which was new to us in understanding it, was that the I don't knows were removed from the calculation. So basically, in order to get an 85% IR rate, it's basically 80 out of 94. The I don't knows, those 6, are pulled out of the 100 surveys and no longer calculated as part of it. So we thought, okay, well, what would the minimum case be or maximum case be if we were to try to change these I don't knows? So best case scenario is we convert every single one of those I don't knows to a yes. So basically we took all 6 of these and we threw them into this upper bucket here, which is when they answer yes. So our I don't knows now become 0. At a best case scenario, now what it did is it changed our denominator. Now we no longer had the I don't knows to remove, so now we have 86 yeses out of 100. Well, that meant our metric was now 86%. So the actual change that we had, if we were to convert all the I don't knows, 6% of them, convert all of those to yeses, we're actually only moving the metric from 85% to 86%, just a 1% improvement. So that 1% improvement was the best case we can expect, and we knew realistically we were not going to be getting all of those converted over. So that was far less of a benefit than we had actually expected up front. So we were scratching our heads and wondering, well, where do we approach this at this point? Since the opportunity is not as big as we thought, maybe there's another way we can find some opportunity and savings. So we asked ourselves, what would happen because we're converting those folks to yeses? The assumption is then they're not going to be calling back as much. We won't have repeat calls. Well, if we were helping to reduce the repeat calls, every one of those phone calls, there's a cost associated with it. So what's the impact if we were to reduce those repeat calls and therefore reduce the cost associated with every repeat call? So for us to do that, this was the calculation we had. Let's just say hypothetically we've got 10 or 11 million calls within a given month. at some point. And if we said, hey, there's 6% that were I don't knows, well, just 6% of that volume ends up being about 660,000 I don't know calls. Well, what we found in looking into it as we measured it is that the callback rate was 11% when people answered yes. When people said, yes, my issue was resolved, still 11% of those folks called back. For those who answered I don't know, 12% of them called back. So there is a 1% improvement that we can make. So if we convert all the I don't knows to a yes, then we're probably going to reduce that callback rate, the repeat calls, by 1 percentage point here. So what's the impact of reducing 1 percentage point in the callback rate among all the calls that those folks who say I don't know, depending on what their call volume was? Well, what we found is when we calculated out, 1% of that ends up being about 6,600 fewer calls. And then over a year, it ends up being about 79,000 fewer calls. If we say that the average call was about $3 a call, which really varies across the different call centers, the type of calls you're dealing with, and all the overhead costs associated, but just for argument's sake, we'll say maybe $3 a call. Well, that ended up being about 200, in this example, 237,000, almost $240,000 worth of savings. Well, for what we're looking into, then the reduction of 79,000 calls or $240,000 as a best case scenario. Again, this is the maximum benefit we can expect if we converted every one of those, the 6% of the volume, to a yes. The best we can hope for was still only 79,000 calls in a year or $240,000 worth using this $3 per call rate. So for what we concluded from looking at it in this way, our conclusion was we just wanted to cancel the project because the maximum benefit, which was still very unrealistic for us to achieve, was much smaller than we originally expected. And it was only by doing this assessment up front we were able to prevent so much time and effort and deep analysis that could have been spent in researching how we convert these folks. By understanding this up front, we saved ourselves so much time and we were able to divert our attention instead on something else that was much more critical, yielding much more benefits than what we originally expected.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I believe there's so much value in doing a pre-assessment like this that I want to challenge you with just a few questions. First of all, what are some previous projects or different initiatives or analyses that you might have worked in the past where you wish you had performed a pre-assessment on them? And if you had done a pre-assessment, would it have made a difference in the outcome of the project or whether you had actually had to execute the project at all? If you had done a pre-assessment, would your leadership at that time, for whenever that project was, would that leadership have agreed to cancel the project or change the direction or scope of the project because maybe the results were different than you originally expected? If the leadership would not have agreed to make any of those changes, then what do you think the additional information is that you could have gotten or maybe should have gotten for a pre-assessment that would have influenced them to agree with your pre-assessment? Now, next one I want to ask is not just on the projects in the past, but what about the projects now that you're working, or whatever analyses or initiatives that you're working right now? What are those that you have now on your plate that maybe should have a pre-assessment done on those? And if you did a pre-assessment and it revealed that the opportunity isn't worthwhile, would it make a difference in how you executed the project from this point forward?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.